All right, Sir Knights, I just want to thank you guys for attending the Grand Commander's chat. I hope that these forums are going to be educational and useful for you. But we're going to have a presentation at least monthly over something that has to do with the Commandery, with the Grand Chapter, and with the Grand Council. And also, too, I want to use these as a discussion point for our local commanderies to help discuss any problems or any ideas that they may have that they can share with other commanderies to help them through the stead as well. And also, too, I want these forums to show that Commandery is more than just inspections. There's history that goes with Commandery. There are different observances and different type of activities that we can do as a Commandery that are available to us if our constituent commanderies would take advantage of those. So that's what I hope that these chats do. I hope they stimulate thoughts. I hope they stimulate action. And with that being said, I will now turn it over to our eminent Grand Junior Warden, Sir Knight Trazen Akers, for his presentation this evening. Thank you, Sir Knights.
Okay. All right, Sir Knights. Thank you for attending this evening. As indicated, I am T.S. Akers, or Trazen Akers, as some of you may know me. I am the Grand Junior Warden of Knights Templar of Oklahoma. And I would like you all to first, I hope everyone did the assigned reading. So if you could, please pick up your copies of the second edition of Knights on the Prairie and turn to page 52. Now I'll give you everyone time to do that for this discussion. No, that was a joke. Ariel convinced me to do that. But I am, of course, the author of Knights on the Prairie, A History of Templarry in Oklahoma, which is the only volume on that subject that exists. So if you don't have a copy of that book, it is available on Amazon, and I recommend you acquire one. It should be required reading for every commandery officer. I also serve as the Curator of Collections at the McAllister Valley of the Ancient Accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. And this is several years ago when Matt McGee was Grand Commander, and we unveiled our newly installed exhibit on Templary and Indian Territory and what would become Oklahoma. It is believed that the birthplace of Masonic teachings in America was at Tun Tavern in Philadelphia in 1731. This was followed by the reprinting of Anderson's Constitutions of the Freemasons by Benjamin Franklin in 1734. As Freemasonry gained speed in the colonies, it was not uncommon for higher or side degrees to be conferred in addition to the 3 degrees of the symbolic lodge. The 2 more prevalent of these additional degrees were that of the Holy Royal Arch and the Order of the Temple. The earliest recorded conferral of the Order of the Temple was within St. Andrew's Lodge in Boston on August 28, 1769. It is believed that the ritual for the degree was provided by members of the various military lodges of the British Army then stationed in the area. Templary in America was loosely practiced from then on until the Grand Encampment of Knights Templar of the United States was formally organized in 1816. Now, the image we see here, this is an Independence Day parade in McAllister, Indian Territory in 1906. The large building in the distance we see there is the Busby Hotel, built by McAllister Scottish Rite Mason William Busby. And we see a McAllister Commandery there with a parade. Those children, I'm told, were orphan children who had come out with hopes of being adopted that day. Templary would arrive in what would become the state of Oklahoma in the summer of 1890. The land run of 1889 opened up what was known as the unassigned lands to settlement, and the Oklahoma Territory was established. The summer of 1890 was a very busy summer indeed. In addition to the creation of the territorial government, a group of 20 Sir Knights in Guthrie petitioned the Grand Encampment to form a Commandery of Knights Templar on July the 12th, 1890. Guthrie Commandery No. 1 was granted a dispensation to work with Cassius M. Barnes as eminent commander. Barnes would go on to serve as the 4th territorial governor of Oklahoma, and this is Barnes that we see here. The proceedings for the 1892 triennial of the Grand Encampment show that Templary was gaining momentum in the sister territories that would become the state of Oklahoma. Both Muskogee Commandery No. 1 in Indian Territory and Oklahoma Commandery No. 2 at Oklahoma City in Oklahoma Territory received dispensations to work during this period. The next 2 years saw the creation of 3 more commanderies in the region. In Oklahoma Territory, Ascension Commandery No. 3 was established at El Reno in 1893. In Indian Territory, Chickasaw Commandery No. 2 at Purcell and McAllister Commandery No. 3 were established in 1894. With 3 commanderies each now residing in the 2 territories, the groundwork was laid for the creation of grand commanderies. And this is where Templary sort of takes a dramatic turn, I guess you could say, from the rest of the York Rite in what would become Oklahoma, because the Grand Chapter of Indian Territory exercised jurisdiction over Oklahoma Territory. So when the state of Oklahoma was born, there was only one Grand Chapter, and that was because Indian Territory's Grand Chapter never relinquished jurisdiction over Oklahoma Territory. The first chapters of Royal Arch Masons in the Indian Territory received, they were formed from chapters in Arkansas, so sort of like Blue Lodge Masonry spread into the Indian Territory from Arkansas, so did Capitular Masonry, and Capitular Masonry carried over into the Oklahoma Territory. Templary was distinctly different in that you had a body of men in Guthrie, Oklahoma Territory, seek to form a commandery from the Grand Encampment, and you had a body of men in Muskogee and Indian Territory seek to form a commandery from the Grand Encampment. So that's why you had Muskogee Commandery No. 1 of Indian Territory and Guthrie Commandery No. 1 of Oklahoma Territory. Some notes on Templary in Indian Territory and Muskogee in particular. Muskogee Commandery No. 1 was granted a dispensation to form on October the 1st, 1891, but the citizens of Muskogee were no strangers to the Knights Templar. When the cornerstone for the federal courthouse at Muskogee was laid on June 24th, 1889, the Knight Templar Band of Coeur de Leon Commandery No. 17 of Parsons, Kansas, came all the way to Muskogee for the occasion. They came down on the MKT, the Katy Railway. And Joseph S. Murrow had actually been made a Knight Templar in Coeur d'Alene Commandery in 1880. Murrow, of course, being known as the father of Freemasonry in Oklahoma. And another Indian Territory Mason was also from Parsons, Kansas, and that was William Busby, who is essentially the father of modern McAllister. When Muskogee Commandery No. 1 was instituted, Sir Knights from Parsons once again came to Muskogee, and they came for that particular ceremony. Now, the charter members of Muskogee Commandery are sort of like a who's who of past presiding grand officers. So men who would become past presiding grand officers. Those include Robert W. Hill, Leo Bennett, Joseph S. Murrow, Edmund H. Doyle, Zachary T. Walrond, William Noble, Patrick J. Byrne, James Elliott, Jabez H. Mann, and James A. Scott. Also, a charter member of Muskogee Commandery No. 1 was James J. McAllister, for whom the city of McAllister was named, and then there was this gentleman, Pleasant Porter, and Pleasant Porter was actually elected principal chief of the Muskogee Nation in 1899. I believe this photograph probably dates to 1899 or shortly thereafter. The portrait next to Pleasant Porter there is that of Chief Minuaw of the Muskogees, and he fought at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814. And because Pleasant Porter is posing with a famous Creek chief here, or Muskogee chief here, that's why I believe this photograph was probably after Porter became principal chief. And I believe this is probably the earliest known photograph of a Sir Knight in regalia from the Indian Territory. And Porter's regalia is interesting to me in the fact that it's sort of what they had available. He has a chapeau, he has a sword and sword belt and gauntlets there, but the coat is likely just a black frock coat. It was in Indian Territory that the idea for a Grand Commandery was first proposed. On December 27th, 1899, a convention was held at Muskogee for the purpose of forming a Grand Commandery. Muskogee Commandery number 1, Chickasaw Commandery number 2, and McAllister Commandery number 3 assembled and formed the Grand Commandery Knights Templar of Indian Territory. The first Grand Commander was Robert W. Hill of Muskogee. Indian Territory's neighbors to the west were taking note, and she would soon have a younger sister. On November the 8th, 1895, the Grand Master of the Grand Encampment granted a special warrant to those commanderies in Oklahoma Territory to form a Grand Commandery in the same fashion as Indian Territory. It is due to this allegiance to a national governing body that sister Grand Commanderies came to be in the Twin Territories. Though the Sir Knights of Indian Territory were the proverbial Sooners in the run to establish a Grand Commandery, a conclave was called at Guthrie on February the 10th, 1896, for the purpose of establishing such a grand body. That day, representatives of Guthrie Commandery number 1, Oklahoma Commandery number 2, and Ascension Commandery number 3 duly formed the Grand Commandery of Oklahoma. You'll note that there is no territory added. It was just the Grand Commandery of Oklahoma. The lateness of this action was apparently due in part to Ascension number 3 not being properly instituted, an issue that was rectified shortly after being brought to the Grand Master's attention. Now this is an original sword belt that belonged to a Sir Knight of Oklahoma Commandery number 2. And you'll note the belt plate there specifically indicates that Oklahoma Commandery number 2. And these red leather belts, I should say, that's called Russia leather. These or red Russia leather belts were popular before the turn of the 20th century. And here we see the Grand Commandery of Oklahoma assembled at Guthrie in 1902. And again, something to note here are the differences in uniforms of the Sir Knight. We have some in short sack coats, some in long frock coats, a variety of swords, a variety of belts, and you'll note some are wearing the baldric or sash, and some are not, and that particularly relates to rank. And then you'll note that there are roll collars and standing collars, so it's sort of a wide variety. In the creation of the Grand Commandery of Oklahoma, Cassius M. Barnes was once again at the helm. Having been the first commander of Guthrie Commandery number 1, his fellow Sir Knights of Oklahoma Territory placed their trust in him as their first Grand Commander. Upon the forming of the Grand Commandery of Oklahoma, Barnes gave a stirring address which included these remarks: "We seek to join together in bonds that are more sacred and binding, if possible, than any other can be. Those who have proven themselves by terms of pilgrimage and warfare through the degrees of the ancient craft, who have wrought in the quarries and brought forth good specimens of their skill in the Masonic art, and who have by successfully traveling rough and rugged roads arrived at high eminence in the Royal Arch, and by their patience and perseverance, their constancy, courage, and fortitude, have demonstrated their capacity and fitness to be clothed as princes of the royal household." As the Grand Commanders would meet each year in conclave, they would often provide their members with souvenirs of those occasions. This is a conclave attendance ribbon from Indian Territory, the eighth annual conclave held in 1902. The ribbon indicates this is compliments of McAllister Commandery number 3. So this, again, from Indian Territory's Grand Commandery. And then here we see the Grand Commandery of Oklahoma's officers assembled in 1905. As the Sir Knights marched through the years that marked the turn of the century, the merging of the two territories into one state was ever present in their minds, and this also meant that the time would ultimately come for the two Grand Commanderies to consolidate. Government inaction would delay statehood, though the Sir Knights of the Twin Territories began discussing merging as early as 1905. Grand Commander John Coyle of Indian Territory noted this inaction towards unification by Washington in his 1906 address with the remark, "Alas, poor Congress." It was in 1907 that statehood became a reality and the twin territories were combined into one. Now, we know that the Grand Encampment meets in a triennial every 3 years. These are triennial attendance duels from the 31st triennial held at Chicago in 1910. So this is what the Sir Knights would have worn as part of the Indian Territory and Oklahoma Territory delegation. So on the viewer's left there, we see this is an Indian Territory jewel that I believe was probably struck by Trinity Commandery, and it recognizes the Grand Commander of Indian Territory, Roy D. Fuller of Tulsa. The jewel in the center there is also an Indian Territory jewel featuring the skull and crossbones and the Indian head. And this is, I believe this was the jewel struck by the Grand Commander of Indian Territory itself. And then on the viewer's right there, we see the Oklahoma Commandery, or the Oklahoma Territory Grand Commandery attendance jewel from 1910. In a 1910 letter to Grand Commander Fuller of Indian Territory, the newly elected Grand Master of the Grand Encampment, William B. Milish, stated that it would give him great pleasure to hear of steps being taken towards consolidation, and that he hoped to receive news of such steps while traveling in England. While the tone of the letter was certainly pleasant, such correspondence from the supreme authority of Templary in the United States was without question an ultimatum. This is Henry K. Ricker, who was Grand Commander of Oklahoma. And in 1908, in his 1908 address, he had the following to say: "We are now a state with two grand bodies within our borders, and in my judgment that ought not to prevail, and one that should be met with an earnest purpose to promote the welfare of our beloved order in this new state." Now this is 1908. We know the Grand Lodge of the state of Oklahoma was not formed by the Twin Territories until 1909. So in 1908, the Templars in the new state of Oklahoma are recognizing that they're going to have to merge. They're not going to be able to continue on as two separate Grand Commanderies. Also in 1908, the Grand Commander of Indian Territory held a special conclave on the subject of consolidation. The most excellent Grand Master of the Grand Encampment at the time, Henry H. Rugg, was there at that meeting, and on their vote for consolidation was 36 in favor with 22 against. Now that was only 62% of Sir Knights were in favor of consolidating, and they needed 38 votes. They only had 36 in order to proceed with that. And it is my belief that the strong sentiment against Indian Territory merging with Oklahoma had everything to do with the grand officers not wanting to relinquish their offices. And we'll see how that plays out a little later. On April 21st, 1911, Indian Territory held its annual conclave for that year, and they then in 1911, in spring of 1911, adopted a resolution to consolidate with Oklahoma Territory, or the Grand Commandery of Oklahoma, I should say. The two Grand Commanderies met on October the 6th, 1911, at the Skirvin Hotel, and they formed in procession at 9 in the morning. And the Sir Knights then marched to the Baptist White Temple on Broadway in Oklahoma City, which we see here. This is the Baptist White Temple here. This is the Grand Commandery assembled in 1914, just a few short years after consolidation. The procession that morning was led by Sir Knight Orrin Ashton, who we see here, and he was mounted on a white steed, and the Knight Templar band was directly behind him. Ashton was a member of Oklahoma Commandery number 3, and he went on to become Grand Commander in 1922. Once all the remaining business of the Grand Commanderies was settled, Grand Master Milish declared the Grand Commandery of Indian Territory closed without day forever. Immediately following Indian Territory surrendering her charter was the election of officers for the consolidated Grand Commandery. The first Grand Commander of the Consolidated Grand Commandery of Oklahoma was Robert H. Henry of the former Indian Territory. The first Deputy Grand Commander was Guy W. Bohannon of the former Oklahoma Territory. And they elected officers so on down the line, alternating between the two territories. For the first time in the history of the Grand Encampment of Knights Templar of the United States, two Grand Commanderies joined as one. And what's important to note here is that when we look at the Grand Lodge of the state of Oklahoma and you look at their proceedings, they tell you which annual proceeding it is of the Grand Lodge of Indian Territory, which annual proceeding it is of the Grand Lodge of Oklahoma Territory, and then the Grand Lodge of the state of Oklahoma. The Grand Commandery of Indian Territory ceased to exist on October 6, 1911. It ceased to exist and folded under the Grand Commandery of Oklahoma. So there was no continuation of that grand body. And that's why I said it's important to note that when the Grand Commandery of Oklahoma was formed, they made no mention of territory at the onset. So it was just the Grand Commandery of Oklahoma, and that lineage has consisted from its date of formation through today. And this is John R. Hamill, who was the outgoing Grand Commander of Oklahoma. He didn't serve a full term owing to the consolidation. It was a very brief term that he had. And that day he said, "Sir Knights of both jurisdictions, we have heretofore marched along the highway in parallel columns. Now let us march along in a single column, and we will continue to grow in Templar masonry until we have time set a vote of stone that the memory of our consolidation may remain with us as vivid as it is this moment, so that when, like our sires, we are gone, our sons will sing our praises and memory of this deed redeemed." Now that day, they commissioned a photograph to be made of the oldest living past commanders of Indian Territory, and we see those men here. On the viewer's left, we have James E. Humphrey, who was Grand Commander of Indian Territory in 1896. Next, we have Daniel M. Haley, who was Grand Commander of Indian Territory in 1902. Then we have Edmund H. Doyle, who was Grand Commander of Indian Territory in 1897. And then the last fellow there is James A. Scott. He was actually Grand Commander of Oklahoma in 1915, so after consolidation. And I wanted to show the difference between a past Grand Commander's Jewel of Indian Territory and a past Grand Commander's Jewel of Oklahoma or Oklahoma Territory. This is the past Grand Commander Jewel of Daniel M. Haley. This is from 1902. On the rays of the cross there, we see PGC for past Grand Commander. And then on the lower array, I'm not sure if you can see it that well, is an engraved Indian with the letters TER for territory, and so Indian Territory. Now this is DeForest F. Leach of Oklahoma Commandery number 3. He served as Grand Commander in 1897. I believe this photograph was taken around 1910, or shortly thereafter, because he wears the 1910 triennial jewel. I also think he's wearing a Knights of Pythias jewel, so he was obviously a member of other fraternal orders. But you'll see there that he has his past Grand Commander's jewel, which is what became the standard past Grand Commander's jewel of Oklahoma, which we see here. This is from the collections of the McAllister Scottish Rite. This belonged to Rennie L. Moore, who served as Grand Commander in 1956. Moore was also the manager of the Albert Pike Hospital in McAllister. This is an early Templar uniform. This actually belonged to Henry S. Johnston. Johnston joined the Scottish Rite in 1913. He probably joined the York Rite about the same time. He became Grand Master of Masons in 1924. He became governor of the state of Oklahoma in 1926, and he was impeached and removed from office in 1929. The charges brought against Johnson included using the National Guard to prevent being impeached in 1927, pardoning a murderer, and mismanagement of the Highway Commission. Johnson's esoteric pursuits were also questioned. He was sort of a serial joiner of organizations. It was alleged he was hosting seances in the governor's mansion, visiting an astrologer, and he had both a swami and a yogi on call. Of the 11 charges brought against Johnson, he was only convicted of the charge of general incompetence. And this is also in the collections of the McAllister Scottish Rite. So you can come down and see this there in our museum. Here we see Templar filled drill cores on the drill field in 1922. The first field drill competitions were actually held in 1921. So these were just a year after those first competitions. This is a drill badge with bars for years of participation that belong to a Sir Knight. You'll see that the first bar on this is Oklahoma City, 1922. So this is a Sir Knight who began in the drill competitions immediately after that first year. And he had a good long run. And these badges were actually designed after the Grand Commandery of Kansas drill badge. Here we see Oklahoma Commandery number 3 assembled on Easter Sunday in 1922. This is actually a longer photograph that I've trimmed the edges off of so we can see it a little better. And if you zoom in, if you spend any amount of time looking at faces of old Masons, if you zoom in on this photograph, you can see some familiar faces like Leslie Swan and George W. Spencer, who was Grand Recorder for a number of years. The 1920s were essentially the golden age of Templary. They were really the golden age of fraternalism. As we know, our Scottish Rite temples were built in the 20s. Bethlehem Commandery number 45 of Oklahoma City was formed in 1922, and within her first year of existence, she had 104 Sir Knights on her rolls. Oklahoma Commandery number 3 was the largest commandery in 1923 with 694 Sir Knights. The next two largest commanderies were Muskogee Commandery number 2 with 527 Sir Knights and Trinity Commandery number 20 at Tulsa with 505 Sir Knights. Membership in the order statewide swelled to 7,425 Sir Knights in 1925, and that was sort of the high watermark. We never had more than those 7,400 Sir Knights. And this is the Field Drill Corps of Oklahoma Commandery number 3. And this is actually at Oklahoma City University in 1925. So this today, this building is right off of 23rd Street in Oklahoma City. And then this is the Templar sword of Bert D. Ashbrook. Ashbrook was knighted in Emmanuel Commandery number 23 of Blackwell. He later affiliated with Ascension Commandery number 4, and he served as Grand Commander in 1927. This is a beautiful sword. It's an Iowa regulation pattern sword, so it doesn't adhere to Oklahoma regulations at all. But what I have always found striking about this particular sword is the engraving style on there. And swords of this period tend to feature this same style of engraving. Now, I began this talk with the cover of my book, Knights on the Prairie, and I wanted to show that photograph from the cover. It's heavily cropped on the cover just to show those mounted Templars. This is the full photograph, and this was the Grand Commandery Conclave at Tulsa in 1929. This is on the side of First Presbyterian Church, and in the distance there you can see the downtown Tulsa Masonic Temple. I cut this up into sections so we could see it a little better. So this is the Saba Grotto band that participated in the parade for the Grand Conclave. Here we see those mounted parade marshals. And again, this is another one of those photographs. If you look really closely at their boots, and you can see their knee-high boots there. I don't necessarily know if they're riding boots, but their knee-high boots there all have Maltese crosses on them. This is a Tulsa City band that also took part in the parade. And then in the background there, you can see the downtown Tulsa Masonic Temple. And over at the entrance, you can see Sir Knights in their chapeau assembled. And then I wanted to close today with a photograph of this is the cornerstone ceremony for the Bryan County Courthouse in Durant in 1917. I think we're all familiar with our cornerstone ceremonies and the participation of the Knights Templar in those particular ceremonies. That concludes my presentation on the history of early Templary in Oklahoma. If you aren't already following me on Facebook, I recommend you do so at OK Masonic History. And of course, that is our McAllister Scottish Rite Temple. So I'm going to stop sharing and open up the floor to questions.
Hey, Trazen.
Yes.
Do you have any information on how the numbering, because you had two Commandery number ones, how the negotiations went with that?
Yes,
as far as
so
the numbering goes?
yeah.
I didn't know if you touched on that or not.
So the way the numbers worked out is Guthrie Commandery number 1 and Muskogee Commandery number 1 had the same charter dates by the Grand Encampment. They did not have the same dates of dispensation, and the same goes with Oklahoma Commandery number 3 and Muskogee Commandery, which is number 2 today. So Guthrie Commandery number 1 is the oldest commandery by date of dispensation. And then Muskogee Commandery and Oklahoma Commandery had the same charter dates, but Muskogee Commandery has the earlier date of dispensation. Oklahoma Commandery number 3 has the later date of dispensation. And any other commanderies that had the same charter dates, they settled those numbering disputes by date of dispensation.
Trace, and your cornerstone pictures caught my attention. I actually have pictures of ours with all the Templars and the Shrine Band in our vault. I intend to scan those and send them to you. I don't think you've ever had a chance to look at those that I know of.
No, I haven't. I'd love to see those. Yeah.
So, hey, Tracy, this is Jim again.
Yes.
So was the Grand Commander of Indian Territory, was it forced to be closed, cease to exist by the Grand Master of the Grand Encampment, or was that a negotiated item within the Sir Knights of Oklahoma that it would cease to exist? Unlike what you mentioned today, the Grand Lodge of Indian Territory, Oklahoma Territory, they technically still exist in the proceedings and stuff.
I believe that was a hand that was forced by the Grand Encampment. There's never really been any, I've never come across any particular mention of that, but the remarks of the Grand Master of the Grand Encampment that day saying that the Grand Commander of Indian Territory is now closed without day forever. So he officially closed the Grand Commandery of Indian Territory, and that the reason why, or what I speculate is behind that is that the Grand Commandery of Oklahoma and the state of Oklahoma, the name of Oklahoma was sort of the preeminent name there. So there was no reason for the Grand Commandery of Indian Territory to continue. They closed that Grand Commandery and merged, all of their members and funds and everything else under the Grand Commandery of Oklahoma. And this is one of the reasons why I believe that the Grand Commander of Indian Territory was opposed to consolidation in 1908, is that they didn't want to give up their autonomy, they didn't want to give up their legacy, they didn't want to give up their resources. We know that the Grand Chapter of Indian Territory and the Grand Council of Indian Territory exercised jurisdiction over Oklahoma Territory, and that they never had to close any sort of body. So these men all knew each other. They were all social and friendly. They didn't want the Grand Commander of Indian Territory to disappear. But as we know, the Grand Encampment has final say in just about anything, and whether we agree with it or not. And that was the route that was taken.
Trace, and another little side note, when I was doing research for a paper I wrote on the various locations that our Commandery and Muskogee bodies have resided, ultimately ending in the building we're in now. I ran across information where during this merger that Muskogee Commandery actually financed the paying of the letterhead, the making of a seal and all for the new Grand Commandery, because I guess at that time Muskogee had the bucks. But it was interesting to find that information that they financed it. Interesting, I never found where we were paid back. So maybe I need to get with our current Grand Recorder and see what the interest would be.
And Muskogee was obviously they were the office of the Grand Recorder for Indian Territory for a long period of time, and continued as such for the Grand Commandery or the Grand York Rite of Oklahoma for many years as well.
Hey, Tracy, when did the attendance ribbons, when did those cease? Do you have any
There's
history on that?
there's no particular year that they ceased. In my own collection, I have some from the 50s. So there were, and it wasn't just for some years they would actually strike a special jewel just for the Grand Conclave in Oklahoma. So there were some years that there were jewels made. There were some years that there were ribbons made. By the end, it was usually just a ribbon, and I think the latest ones I've seen are from the late 50s. So by the 60s, 70s, they had fallen by the wayside. So, but it was when you go to the triennial, they give everyone who attends the triennial a jewel just for attending the triennial now. And what it was those were a carryover of that you would have a memento from the occasion, and you could wear it on your uniform, at that Grand Conclave and potentially for the year following. So, and it was a way for Grand Commanders to memorialize themselves, because their name could appear on the ribbon, or the location where the Grand Conclave would appear on the ribbon. They were nice mementos. They weren't nearly as large as the jewel that Muskogee recently had struck to commemorate their which centennial was it, Mark?
That was since the large word is beyond my tongue today. That was our 125th. And when John was sending us the information asking for sizes, we might have gone a little big, but go big or go home.
That's right. They look good. So, I think that's sequicentennial, isn't it? Or no, I might be wrong. No, I'm probably wrong.
And I think you're close. And I guess my theory was that our membership is aging, so make things big enough they can see them.
There you go. Well, if we don't have any other questions, I'll turn this back over to our Grand Commander.